Welcome to another episode of Dismantling DEI, a publication of the Goldwater Institute. I'm your host, Kevin Jackson. This particular episode, we have invited Nico Perrino, the Executive Vice President of FIRE, Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. Hard to believe that we actually have to fight for individual rights of expression these days, but we do. So let's welcome Nico Perrino. So welcome, Nico.
Happy to be here, Kevin.
Happy to be in the city of, this isn't brotherly love. What is it? What do they call it? DC?
I don't know. Some people call it the swamp.
Right, the swamp, the deep state. So we're going to discuss DEI, obviously, from a mostly academic point of view. If there's something else you'd like to cover, I'd certainly like to do that. FIRE, interesting organization.
Yep.
Foundation for Individual Rights of Expression.
And expression, yeah.
Right. Interesting that that an organization needs to form for something like that. So maybe you could touch on the origins of FIRE a little bit before we get into the discussions of DEI.
Yeah. We had two co-founders, Harvey Silverglade, a criminal defense attorney based out of Boston, and a professor, Alan Charles Kors, professor at the University of Pennsylvania, and they were classmates at Princeton. And they had noticed in the 80s and 90s, both in Harvey's criminal and civil liberties practice and on campus at the University of Pennsylvania, where Alan Charles Kors taught, this growing illiberalism, the rise of speech codes and the prevalence of censorship. And they wrote this book called The Shadow University, The Betrayal of Liberty on America's College Campuses. And they wrote this book, it came out in the mid-90s, and they were shocked by the response. They started getting phone calls from students and faculty members across the country complaining about the censorship that they were experiencing on their college campuses, the violations of academic freedom that they were seeing on their college campuses. And they're just two guys with day jobs, right? And they don't have the capacity to respond to all these requests for help. So that's when they decided to create an organization. They created FIRE in 1999. It was originally called the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, but in 2022 we expanded our free speech mission off campus.
Interesting, because I remembered it being in education,
Yep.
which is the premise of what we kind of had you guys here for. You mentioned the two different guys, and we talked about it before. There are two different political ideologies at play here, right?
Yes. So FIRE is a nonpartisan organization. We have staff members from across the political and ideological spectrum. It's a unique organization in that respect, and distinguishable from organizations like the ACLU, for example, insofar as when we're defending free speech rights on college campuses and beyond, we don't comment on the speech that we defend. For us, it's enough that it's protected by the First Amendment or by First Amendment standards. And we couldn't comment on the speech that we protect because, again, we have people from across the political and ideological spectrum working at FIRE, coming together around the shared principle of defending free speech and academic freedom. We don't agree on the issues. And that's what actually makes working at FIRE fun. And it's what makes us, I think, a principled organization when we're defending these rights on campus.
Well, I knew you guys from the left side of the aisle, which, a lot of the people from the ACLU were there, which, again, not casting any particular spin on it,
yeah.
But that was where I knew you, and that's why when I noticed that you guys I'm going, okay, these are ACLU guys having to come to the defense of freedom of expression. I found it somewhat odd. I'd like to maybe segue into academia talking about this. I had a young lady years ago come up to me, and she says, Kevin, in my university classes, she says, I can't speak freely. I pretty much regurgitate what the professor says to get my grade. And she's a passionate patriot.
Yeah.
But she says, I just tell them what they want to hear and move on. And I ask her, what percentage of students do you think are actually doing that versus the number who are actually sort of becoming indoctrinated and drinking the Kool-Aid? I don't expect you to have a statistic for that. But just think about it. You're a young student. You formulated your own ideas about what you have in life. And a professor has the ability of theoretical life and death, from a perspective of your professional life and death, because you disagree with their ideology. And I think that's what turned the light. And this was over a decade ago that this happened. But are you guys seeing this, and what sort of prompted FIRE? I mean, you've obviously given us the reason why it was started, but give us some ideas around, from a DEI perspective, where we are now and how that impetus that got FIRE started.
Yeah, well, I mean, you're absolutely right, Kevin, is that there is this epidemic of self-censorship on college campuses right now. And I don't have the statistic in front of me, but we do have the statistics available, and it's quite shocking. And I think students are self-censoring because they're seeing the censorship that happens on their college campuses. This is the idea of a chilling effect, right? To the extent censorship exists, other students or other faculty members self-censor. So from the DEI perspective, diversity, equity, inclusion, this is something that we started seeing bubbling up on college campuses about a decade ago. We peg it to the fall of 2014, when at Brown University, former New York City Police Commissioner Ray Kelly was set to speak, and he was shouted down by students, I think like moments or minutes into his speech. And from this moment on, we started to see this rise of microaggression policing, safe spaces, calls for disinvitations, shouting down of speakers, even barricading buildings so audiences couldn't go into those buildings and hear the speaker they wanted to hear. Famously, Milo Yiannopoulos was set to appear at the University of California, Berkeley in 2017.
Ann Coulter was getting a lot of that as well during that time.
Yeah. And actually a couple of years ago, Ann Coulter was set to speak at her alma mater of Cornell, and she was shouted down by students who engaged in this weird tactic where one student would stand up, shout her down, get escorted out by police, and then as soon as that other individual was escorted out, another student would stand up, shout her down, get escorted by police. It ended up being this game of whack-a-mole, but there was this weird moment where one of the students said, "We don't want you here, your words are violence. We don't want you here, your words are violence." And I think that statement is indicative of this broader trend that we're seeing where when people say something that they find offensive or hurtful, they're conflating that statement with actual physical violence.
Right.
And I think that is very dangerous for a democracy. Sigmund Freud is said to have said that civilization was started the first day man cast a word instead of a stone. Democracy is what we do instead of violence to mediate our difference. And to the extent you're conflating words with actual physical violence, you are then become justified in using actual violence in response to words. And that's the whole ballgame.
Well, you say that you see Brown as sort of the catalyst, the spark. You know, we've watched it over, and some people might argue that it goes back farther than that, and that's fine. Who cares? We just
it almost certainly goes back farther than that. It's just that's when we start to see this precipitous rise
of it, right? So, but now that we've recognized it, and obviously FIRE, you guys focus on it. Where's it gone since then? I mean, we've seen a decade go by. You would think that colleges and universities are supposed to be free thought, free expression, and to explore all these ideas, and yet it's massive censorship.
Yes, yeah. So I love this idea that the University of Chicago put out, that colleges and universities are there for the preservation, dissemination, and creation of knowledge. Yale also has this famous Woodward report where they said on Yale's campus you should be free to think the unthinkable, challenge the unchallengeable, and mention the unmentionable. Now, that doesn't bear out in actual practice, unfortunately.
Yeah,
and in fact, when one faculty member tried to have that policy, that Woodward policy applied in a lawsuit, Yale went into court to actually disavow the policy and say this is just something that we say that's laudatory or it's an articulation of principle, but it's not actual policy. What we're seeing on college campuses are, for example, Emerson College. You have this student group, TPUSA, that handed out stickers that said China kinda sus. This is during the COVID pandemic. Sus is young person slang for suspicious. For this, the college president sent out a university or a college-wide email that accused the group of anti-Asian hate and bias. The idea being that if you criticize the Chinese government, it's anti-Asian hate and bias. No mind that at least a third of the students who were members of TPUSA were themselves Asian, as well as the vice president of the student group, KJ Lynham. And you saw a lot of that during COVID as well. You have Thomas Smith, who is a professor at the University of San Diego, who wrote a blog post who said that if you are buying that the virus escaped from a lab, you're swallowing a bunch of Chinese cockswaddle. And for this, he was investigated, again, on this sort of anti-Chinese bias, the idea being you can't criticize the Chinese government or question a theory that is now one of the leading theories of United States intelligence agencies, lest you've run afoul of this sort of DEI program that exists on a lot of these campuses.
They should have investigated him for using the word cockswaddle, but it's a whole other issue.
But cockswaddle, sus, they always involve these sort of weird,
the
sort
terminology,
of weird words.
the lexicon.
But I mean, we've gotten to a place where you can't even question certain DEI policies that function as litmus tests on college campuses. You have this famous example of this guy, Yoel Inbar, who's an associate professor of psychology at the University of Toronto, and he was looking at a job at UCLA where his partner was being hired. And I guess on some of these college campuses, you get privileged review if your partner is going to be hired on as a faculty member. And he, in his own right, is a very well-established scholar. And he was sailing through the process to become hired until they learned that he objected to these so-called DEI statements. These are statements that faculty members need to write stating what they're doing to advance DEI criteria in their scholarship. And he objected to this. He thought it was just something that didn't prove anything, that it had no merit. And for this, students rose up in objection to his being hired, and he was eventually denied the job, and very clearly because he objected to these so-called DEI statements. And unfortunately, these DEI statements are prevalent on college campuses. A 2022 study found them either active or being considered on 60% of college campuses.
Is that also permeating, and it's maybe a little bit off subject, but is that also permeating in corporate through some of the ESG stuff? Or
Yes. And you're starting to see a backlash against that.
You are,
though.
right.
Andrew Sullivan, this famous writer and thinker, right-leaning, said in an essay that we all live on campus now.
Yeah.
And the idea being that what happens on campus doesn't stay on campus,
Yep.
that it can permeate into the wider world. So I get frustrated when I hear folks say or dismiss FIRE's work as saying, oh, it's just kids being kids on
Right.
college campuses.
Academia, it's limited.
It's not, though,
Right.
because after my colleague Greg Lukianoff wrote The Coddling of the American Mind with NYU professor Jonathan Haidt for The Atlantic in 2015, they started talking about these trends of trigger warnings, microaggression policing, and campus disinvitations. They were dismissed as saying, oh, okay, these are just kids being kids. But then it started to permeate outside of that, and their book ended up becoming one of Bloomberg's top sellers when it was released in 2018, and the article became a book. And they were receiving countless emails and phone calls from people in corporate America is like, what do we do with these college graduates? There has been a change. What's happening?
Yeah. I think people are now beginning to see that the trends that began in academia, I call it wackademia, is indeed becoming somewhat the norm, to your point, that everything's becoming a college campus. Do you see that evolution, obviously, over the last decade, you believe has exploded more? It certainly hasn't shrunk.
Yeah, well, it's gotten a little bit better, I will say.
Well, let's talk about that a bit.
Yeah.
We looked at colleges and universities, and I can certainly account for at least 10 of them that have rolled back DEI programs. What are your thoughts about this? Is this something that, are they scaling it back to sort of disguise it, or do you think that they're actually legitimately taking a look at this? Because what comes to mind is Evergreen,
Yeah.
remember?
Brett Weinstein.
Right. So why don't you touch on that a little bit and maybe use...
Yeah, so Brett Weinstein, this is in 2017. He's a professor, I believe, of biology. And at Evergreen State College, they had this program that they were doing every year called the Day of Absence, where white students and faculty members would leave the campus. And Brett objected to this. He saw it as segregation. And for this, he was surrounded by a group of students. He was called a white supremacist, and the campus essentially turned into an ungovernable space. You had people coming onto campus with baseball bats looking for Brett, and you had the president who was surrounded by students as well in this building where he essentially was the subject of a struggle session, if people are familiar with Maoist China. And at one point he was told, this is the president, that he couldn't leave. He asked to go to the bathroom. They told him no. So it became essentially ungovernable. And all because Brett objected on a principled basis to this,
segregation.
Yes, to segregation, this Day of Absence program. But for many individuals, this ran contrary to this sort of DEI program that they had come to see as being preeminent at Evergreen. And Evergreen's a unique college. It's very left-leaning college. It has its own identity. But even still, Brett wasn't saying anything bombastic. He was just objecting to segregation. And so that was part of this big, giant wave of DEI that peaked probably during the COVID years and in the wake of the George Floyd protests, but now is very much being called into question. And whether it's actually something significant and a meaningful change on behalf of these colleges and universities or something that's just political expediency? I don't know. That's one of the things that I've grown jaded about, I guess, over the years doing this work, is that these college presidents often don't have any fixed principle to which they govern their universities. That's how you get a situation like Harvard President Claudine Gay after October 7th deciding to issue a statement and then reissuing statements 6 times because she was just acting like a weather vane and she kept messing it up. Now colleges are getting out of the statement issuing game altogether. It's this idea of institutional neutrality, that they're not issuing statements on abortion or the election or October 7th or any other hot button issue of the day. And this goes back to a policy the University of Chicago passed in 1967 in what their famous Calvin statement that said, the universities are the host and sponsors of the critics. They are not themselves the critics. They're a forum for criticism. So you're starting to see colleges and universities abandon these DEI statement policies. Most famously, Harvard did it recently. MIT has done it. Another number of big colleges and universities have done it. So where Harvard goes, other colleges and universities tend to follow. So I'm optimistic on that front. But again, I think the most important thing these colleges and universities can do to avoid this DEI vortex is to understand what the mission of their university is. As University of Chicago, preservation, dissemination, creation of knowledge. Harvard's motto is veritas, truth, right? So that truth-seeking mission needs to be put front and center. And to the extent you have this other value that's put front and center that's sometimes in conflict with that other value, I think that's where you get into trouble.
Well, so you touched on the Claudine Gay ultimately leaving, right? She left?
She resigned,
She resigned. So it reminds me of the University of Missouri, where they had it was more of a racial issue, but it still had its roots in DEI.
Yeah.
And the chancellor and the provost both ended up quitting because they made a statement about it that they ended up flip-flopping on. They were going back and forth. And to that point, because they weren't based in just solid truth and character of what the university is about, both of those guys end up losing their job over what turned out to be a hoax.
Yeah. Well, what you get with these college presidents, they often resign, and it's because there's no moral leadership. So it wasn't just Claudine Gay at Harvard. It was also Liz McGill at the University of Pennsylvania. Yeah. 2 of the 3 college presidents who testified in front of Congress in December of 2023 on the post-October 7th fallout resigned. And it's because they just didn't know what the purpose of their college or university was, and so they couldn't answer questions consistent with that.
Let's talk about what happened at Evergreen again, because I want to touch on, I don't want to politicize this, but college campuses, for the most part, are left-leaning. I mean, I think we would
they are.
pretty much agree with this. And we end up with these kids that go from this this idea of what thought should be in terms of DEI to their actions being pretty violent.
Yes.
I mean, in effect, kidnapping the president of the university or the chancellor at Evergreen. I mean, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, when you have these environments that are so skewed in one direction politically, you end up getting group polarization, and you get this polarization spiral. So, for example, at New England colleges and universities, for every 25 liberal professors, you have 1 conservative professor. And my colleague Greg Lukianoff talks about the conformity gauntlet that you often see on college and university campuses. So you have a campus that skews one direction politically, and then they put something in place like a DEI statement requirement for any faculty member who wants to be hired or promoted. And that functions as another sort of conformity-inducing pressure. Diversity is important on college campuses. Equality is important on college campuses. Inclusion is important on college campuses. And to the extent that college and university administrators are asking their prospective faculty and their current faculty, what are you doing to make students feel welcomed in their classroom? That's one thing. But this DEI concept has taken on this political tone, right? It's being advanced by so-called anti-racism committees, which is a very particular way at looking at race in America.
It's a racist way of looking at race, ironically.
Yeah, well, I'm just the free speech guy, so I'll let you editorialize on that. But we've even done studies, right, where we've asked faculty members to judge different DEI statements. And one of the things that you find is that faculty members who write DEI statements that talk about viewpoint diversity or even socioeconomic diversity are downgraded next to the faculty members who talk about race and sex. So there's this very politicized or narrow conception of what it means to be diverse, what it means to be inclusive.
So
And I
they're
think
drawing ideological lines is what...
yeah, they're drawing ideological lines around it that has the result of functioning as a political litmus test. And I think you saw this a little bit in the post-October 7th fallout, where Jews were shocked to see that they didn't fall within this DEI framework.
Right.
And so you get this bizarre scenario where at Harvard, for example, fat phobia is seen as a form of violence, but you can say from the river to the sea or intifada. And to be clear, as a free speech advocate, I think both things should be protected on
Sure.
college campuses. Even hateful, offensive, bigoted things should be protected so long as it doesn't rise to the level of discriminatory harassment.
Or violence.
Or violence. And that's one of the things we're seeing too much of on college campuses. And FIRE recently ran a survey of 59,000 college students and found that roughly a quarter of college students support using violence in response to a speaker that they disagree with to some extent. Now, it might be rarely, but to even say that in some cases it would be okay to use violence to stop a speaker you disagree with is a fundamentally illiberal.
It's actually shocking.
It is shocking, yes. And it's gone up in recent years, too.
So looking at the litmus test and these 25 to 1...
yes, that's in New England, yeah.
New England, the college of liberal academics to conservative academics. Let's touch on that just a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Do you believe that litmus test is being applied? Well, apparently it is, because of the gentleman you mentioned earlier with UCLA.
Yes.
So that litmus test is being applied. Mm-hmm. We are now seeing that, going back to our earlier discussion, being applied in corporate America, where a lot of the CEOs and the board members are being selected for that reason. I'm on a board of a company. It took them 1.5 years to vet me because of my ideology. And it was a board membership for somebody with my exact background in engineering, computer science, and management consulting. But because they didn't agree with my political ideology, I went through 1.5 year vetting process where it would have taken a month. Yeah. So I can see it personally happening. Where do you see this evolve? I mean, I know we're pushing back on it a bit, but we've certainly seen an evolution where if your politics don't jive with what the narrative is, then the cancel culture tends to kick in.
Yeah, there's just polarization throughout our country, and I'm a historian of the old school civil libertarians who really inspired me, the folks, the men and women who created America's free speech century. And one of the things that's distinguishable about them is that they were not afraid to talk across lines of difference. They weren't afraid to go into places and talk with those that they disagreed with. Their idea was that what we have in common is more important than what divides us.
Sure.
And so that's how you get situations like the former executive director of the ACLU, Ira Glasser, becoming best friends with conservative paragon William F. Buckley, going to baseball games together. That's how you get situations like Ruth Bader Ginsburg becoming friends with Justice Antonin Scalia and even taking vacations together. So we have this problem in America right now where if you disagree with someone, you think there's something morally wrong with them. And I always loved this quote from Abraham Lincoln, who said, "Do I not defeat my enemy when I make him my friend? Do I not defeat my enemy when I make him my friend?" And I think right now we are just looking at our enemies and saying they're always going to remain our enemies. Christopher Hitchens, a famous writer from the 20th century, early 21st century, has this phrase. He's like, the cheapest form of ideological sparring is when someone assumes that someone else's worst possible motive is their only possible motive, that their worst possible motive is their only possible motive. And I think that's how we've approached public discourse lately.
What's interesting to me is communication is the basis for any solid foundation, whether it's corporate or even with their spouse, a significant other, right?
Yeah.
I mean, if you're going to be tight-lipped about how you feel, you're probably not going to last very long in a relationship of any type. And yet, that bedrock of what separates us from the animals is the very thing that we seem to be shutting down. So,
we're depriving ourselves of something important when we shut down speech, even speech that we disagree with. Speech is important because it tells us how the world actually is. My friend and colleague Jonathan Rauch has this famous phrase where he says that censorship is like breaking the thermometer. You don't change the temperature, you just don't know what it is anymore. And so if you have problems in your world, you want to know what people think about those problems. You want to, maybe they're part of the problem. You don't change it, you don't fix anything by shutting people up.
There's lots of quotes you use I'm going to have to steal, Nico. So we've already touched on a little bit of this, but let's investigate this one-sided nature of colleges and universities as it pertains to DEI and this conformity, if you will, of thinking and conformity of thought.
Yeah, as I was mentioning earlier, something like half of faculty across colleges and universities believe that DEI statements function as political litmus tests. That is, they're testing the faculty members to see if they believe the right things before they can advance in the hiring or promotion process. And faculty members know this. They know that these function as political litmus tests. So they sort of lie. Right? They write down things they don't believe. They express opinions they don't believe publicly because they know the consequences. Right. They've seen the censorship that's happened elsewhere on college campuses. So they fall in line. Then you get this weird situation like that emperor has no clothes phenomenon where people all know the truth and all think the same way, but they just don't express it. They don't express it. And DEI has become this kind of politicized concept. Diversity and inclusion, great, right? Equity, great if that's your thing. Equality, great. But faculty members are being denied promotion and hiring opportunities because they want to talk about viewpoint diversity or they want to talk about socioeconomic diversity, and they're not spending all of their time talking or caring about racial and sex diversity. And you even have colleges and universities, for example, like UC Davis had this program surrounding its DEI statements where that was the first line of review. Let's say you're a chemist or you're a physicist, and you fill out your application to become a faculty member at UC Davis. Before they even, you could be a Nobel-winning physicist. Before they even get there, they are looking at your DEI statement, and 45% of applicants had their application thrown away because of their DEI statement alone. At the University of California, Berkeley, it was something like 75% of faculty members.
So let's expound on that. So if that's occurring, so you throw out the Nobel laureate, right? You've essentially done your college or university a disservice because this is a person who's, and I've got my own thoughts about the Nobel Peace Prize, Nobel Prizes, but presuming that it is indeed the creme de la creme, aren't you doing the college a disservice? Aren't you doing whatever organization that is using that as a litmus test a disservice, especially in academia where you're looking for the brightest minds? And it should be based on meritocracy and not the idea that I don't conform with exactly what you're thinking at this particular moment. I mean, where are we headed if that's where we're going to go with this?
Well, that assumes that's what these colleges are trying to do, that they're looking for the best and brightest to admit, and that they are abiding by this University of Chicago principle, preservation, dissemination, and creation of knowledge, and not this DEI idea. That if the DEI idea is the most important, by all means, keep doing the DEI statements, keep establishing your anti-racism committees, but keep establishing your anti-racism committees. But on my ideal college and university campus, truth-seeking is the North Star, and DEI is something that we can maybe consider, but it should not guide everything that happens on that college campus.
You've mentioned the anti-racism a couple of times, which we've, you said you'd let me handle part of that from a social discussion, but you look at Harvard graduating an all-black graduation. You look at these various things that happen on campus where they say no whites allowed, like what happened at Evergreen, the day where they only want BIPOCs or what have you. That means black, indigenous people of color, for those of you who don't know. And others very segregated types of things while talking about diversity, which I find very interesting. It's antithetical, even on its own principle, when you think about what they're doing, and yet it seems like they don't see it.
They have a different conception of what inclusion and diversity means, right?
Inclusion is now become segregation. I'm almost offended if I were to have gone to Harvard and they said, Kevin, would you want to be part of a black graduation? I'd be offended. but we've made that acceptable. I liken it to blacks self-segregating and not even realizing what's happened.
Well, it's not even just acceptable, it's unacceptable to believe otherwise, right? And
Right.
that's what FIRE is spending our time on college campuses fighting against is, okay, you believe this one thing, and we could both think it's stupid, but to dissent from it is akin to violence,
Right.
as the argument goes on some college campuses. So that's a problem. It results in censorship, and it results in even more polarization because people just shut up,
Yeah.
right? They just shut up.
I don't think it's even some. I think that it's become so pervasive that you pretty much know in academia at that level, to your point, that that's going to be a litmus test. And you either you rise above it by conforming or you get pushed off to the wayside.
Well, you have this case at Harvard of Carol Hooven, a faculty member there for a long time, and she wrote a book called Testosterone. She believes that biological sex is real, that testosterone is important, and she was going out and promoting her book, and this offended students at Harvard's campus, and she was driven off campus. She couldn't get any students to TA for her. She got no support from her administration, and now she's not in academia at all. Not in academia at all. So, and this is for going out there and writing a scholarly book.
Based on biology.
Yes, she's a biologist. She has a history there. She wrote it. She's not a partisan of any sort. But
shame on her for being an expert.
Shame on her for just calling it as she sees it, right? Whether you agree with that or not.
Agree or disagree, right?
Yeah, whether you agree with that or not. And other faculty members see that happening. They just keep their mouths shut. Why? Why risk your mortgage, your family's livelihoods? It's just easier to stay quiet.
The emperor has no clothes, right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
Like with the story I told you earlier, this is a lovely young lady from Poland that I was talking about. And she came to America to go to college and speak her mind. And God, Poland may be where all of America ends up going if we keep it at this rate. But I mean, it was this lovely young lady that said, Kevin, I cannot speak my mind in academia with my classes. And it was one thing if you're talking about, classes in, say, sociology or something like that, where you expect it. But we're seeing this now in engineering, and you mentioned if you want to be a physics professor or something that's based completely and totally in science, right? You still got to pass these litmus tests of getting in.
Yeah.
So, but let's talk about the impact on the students. We talked a little bit about the faculty. I mean, kids are choosing their colleges I chose my college based on my degree plan. Mm-hmm. And, now you go to college, you choose it. If I want a great engineering degree, I'd go to MIT. I go to MIT and I find out I've got to conform to all this DEI stuff when all I want is a degree in electrical engineering.
Yeah, well, it's hard to paint the students with a broad brush. So the student you were talking about from Poland, one of the things you find with the immigrant students is that they are definitely coming to American college campuses and expecting a certain thing. Mm-hmm. I think it's the sort of thing that you and I probably agree a college and university should provide.
Sure.
Right? A robust education if it's a liberal arts school, teaching in critical thinking. And there was actually this strange scenario at Reed College. I believe Reed is out in Oregon, where you had students that were protesting in front of this class that was part of the curriculum there that focused on philosophy and the Western canon, and you had students that were protesting the class in front of them. They were just sitting in front of the class for weeks on end, until immigrant students rose up and said, this is not what I came to the United States of America for. I came here to study, I came here to learn, and you're denying me that opportunity. And that's when the protests finally stopped. So you see that a lot with immigrant students coming to the United States and matriculating in our colleges and universities. But I do worry that the younger generation of college students doesn't quite understand free speech and academic freedom. And it's not necessarily their fault. They've been taught the wrong things. They haven't been taught the value of academic freedom and freedom of expression in a college or university environment. Nobody orients them around it when they arrive on campus. Mm-hmm. But they're the ones that are calling for these microaggression policings, these trigger warnings, these campus disinvitations. They're the ones shouting down speakers often. At FIRE in the 2010s, we had the saying that the college students are the best constituency for free speech on campus. It's the administrators, the ones who are trying to keep this sort of tranquil environment on campus, arguing that the sky will fall if they eliminate their speech codes. And we would argue for what we call the strong student model. This idea that you are not too weak as a student to live for freedom. And college students in 2008, 2009 loved this idea. Yeah, this is an idea of empowerment. This is an idea of agency. It harkens back to the Berkeley free speech movement in the 1960s, where they were trying to throw off in loco parentis and all these speech codes. But now you have this movement where college students are calling for speech codes, are calling for censorship. You had this famous article written in the New York Times about Brown University when you had these students, this panel on sexual assault. The title of the article was "In College and Hiding from Scary Ideas," because it talked about how the counter-programming to that article that was created by students was this place where you had frolicking puppies and crayons and could lay in cuddle puddles. Safe space, so to speak.
Well, Van Jones said it, and I'm paraphrasing, but he says, you're going to leave the protective atmosphere of college and you're going to cross into the concrete jungle.
Yes.
And life is going to be very different. But let's touch on that a little bit. So you've got these college students, to whatever degree, whatever percentage, that believe in DEI the way it's being presented from the leftist point of view, entering into corporate America, where we've seen a bit of growth in it. Now we see it waning, coming back the other way. But those views are definitely going into this corporate culture. And the same process of hiring based on meritocracy and not some litmus test of DEI is again being looked at in corporate culture, where they're looking at your Facebook pages and social media posts and things like this before they will even offer you a job. And God forbid you're Kevin Hart, and you're going to do the Grammys or the Emmys or whatever he's doing, and they say, oh, you had a tweet from 11 years ago about an idea that you had way back when that maybe you don't even espouse to any longer. I mean, is this where we're headed?
I sure hope not. I have 2 young kids. I have a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old, right? And their digital footprint is going to be with them for the rest of their life. You're going to get a job at Teen Vogue, in one famous example, and then have it revoked, a short while later because something you tweeted or said when you were 14 years old.
Exactly.
There's this idea that we're losing grace and forgiveness in our society. The idea that someone says something that transgresses or says something that we agree with, they're a witch. And that if they even apologize for what they had said in the past, that put them on the stake, right? Because that makes it all the worse. So
the apology has actually become the worst thing you can do.
And you hate it, right? Because if you are truly remorseful for something you've said or done, you want an apology to work. You want an apology to mean something, but now it doesn't.
No.
It just adds to the pile on. And yeah, we've lost a sense of grace and forgiveness. Being offended is a choice. Being this skepticism that we have of others who disagree with us is a problem, and it's something that is in our mindset, and it's something that we can change. There is no good or bad, but thinking makes it so. And there is certainly bad out there, but you have a movement in the criminal justice space, right, for forgiveness, to allow people to re-enter society. Why don't you see that on the campus space when someone says something that offends you?
The problem I see, Nico, is that if you're only looking at something from one side, I was talking to my son about this the other day. If everything's always good, good is no longer good. There's got to be a line of demarcation, because good can get better, better, better. Well, then good becomes bad, and better is good, right? I mean, that's the evolution of everything. Nico, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about some of the ramifications of this as it pertains to legal and maybe even ethical considerations. I know you guys are involved in multiple lawsuits, or of what's going on there. Maybe you could touch on that a little bit.
Yeah, we have one case in California challenging these guidelines that were put out by the California Community College District. This is a district that governs 1.8 million students in California. And they put out guidelines that said that faculty members in that district had to teach DEI. And it was this very politicized idea of DEI. And they warned faculty members not to weaponize academic freedom against their politicized idea of DEI. And they warned faculty members, and these are their words, not to inflict curricular trauma on their students by dissenting from this highly politicized concept of DEI. And this is a public This is a public community college district, and public colleges and universities in America are bound by the First Amendment. Private colleges, they can abide by other values if they so choose. They're private associations, but many of them say in their policies and have a contractual obligation to abide their policies that free speech and academic freedom exist on those college campuses. So we're challenging the California Community College District. That case is still in court, but that's one of the more aggressive and frankly shocking examples of trying to implement DEI on college campuses by compelling faculty members to teach a certain politicized concept.
And touching on the idea of one-sided arguments, I mean, which I don't think anybody learns from anything like that. I think you've got to. One of the things my brother used to do, my older brother, I've told many people this story, is when I was like 9 years old, he'd come home from college and he'd say, Ferrari versus the Ford pickup, who wins? And I'd go, Ferrari. And then he'd say, I didn't give you the terrain. You know? And you go, okay, you got me.
That's a movie now, right? Ford versus Ferrari.
Oh, you're right. I hadn't even thought about that from the movie perspective. But good
I think
point.
the terrain's a racetrack there, but...
Yeah, but not a Ford pickup versus a Shelby Cobra. No. So, but yeah, so the idea is that somebody poses something, and I don't care what it is. I know I've always learned from derivative discussions, right? Yes. I say something and somebody goes, what about this? And you go, oh, but what about this? And suddenly you've got this beautiful piece of work because everybody keeps contributing. And I also believe that no matter what somebody says, you should jump to the opposite side. And just to give yourself a moment of pause, that even if you believe this, go over here and think about it on the opposite, just to defend it. And but we're not seeing that. So from your perspective, steel's not sharpening steel.
No, it's not. John Stuart Mill, this famous 19th century free speech philosopher, said that he who knows only his side of the argument knows little of that. And frankly, when you have censorship on college campuses and you are not allowing certain arguments to even be posited, no matter how wrong-headed you think they are, you are denying people the opportunity to investigate their own ideas. I went to college campuses a dyed-in-the-wool anti-theist. I came to campus being fixated on the ideas of Christopher Hitchens, Daniel Dennett, Sam Harris, and Richard Dawkins. I joined the Secular Student Alliance. But I had the opportunity to engage with students of faith on my time there, and having those intense late night over pizza arguments about why we're here on earth, right? That's the first question. And while I can't claim to be a person of great religious faith now, I have a deeper respect for it as a result of those conversations. And I think my arguments were sharpened as a result of those conversations. And I'm also a small L libertarian. And if anyone's a political minority on campus, it's probably the small L libertarian. So I feel like I got a great experience in college campus because I was able to argue with the conservatives and liberals, and there was no shortage of them, right? Yeah. And so if you go to a college campus and are only talking with people you disagree, or maybe the people who disagree with you don't exist on that campus or are afraid to speak up, you're just denying yourself the opportunity to sharpen your arguments, And
I think it's a cop-out. If the only thing you want is the one side, I honestly believe, personal opinion, you're not willing to have someone challenge you because maybe you're not as solid in your belief. This happened to me years ago. I was asked by a company that I work for as a partner to go give a presentation on their subject matter. And they had a subject matter expert who couldn't go. She was having a baby or something. And she says, Kevin, you're the smartest guy I know. As a partner, will you go do this for me? And I said, sure. But I was nervous because I knew it about this much, 2 layers deep. She knew it 10 layers deep. Most of the people in the audience 1 layer deep. So I was going to be fine. I get there, and there are some guys that knew it about 5 layers deep. And I will never forget the feeling of being in that audience and these guys asking me questions, and I'm saying to myself, they know more about this than I do. Yeah. And we went sidebar after the event, and we talked about it, and they knew more than I did. It's a humbling feeling.
But I'm sure you learned a ton from that,
Absolutely.
Right? You got in the car afterwards, and you were thinking about all the questions and arguments they made, and it allowed you to investigate your own ideas. This is why the Catholic Church, when it's trying to anoint someone a saint, creates a devil's advocate to go argue against statehood, right? This is why we have our adversarial court process where you have cross-examination, right? You only get a spark when the flint and the stone are moving in opposite directions.
Absolutely. And the biggest thing that I learned was I don't want that feeling again. So when you posit something and you say, here's what I believe, my first thing is go on the other side and play devil's advocate against yourself. Because how are you going to, base yourself in some firmness of that if you can't argue against it on your own? So I think that they're doing themselves a disservice, and I think that's maybe, and I'd love your opinion about this, but I think that's probably why we're seeing it sort of decline, is because there's not the ability to, when you pose an argument about equality and you say to somebody, make us all equal. It's a pretty simple idea. I tell you what, we're two people right here, you and I. I dare you to make us equal.
Yeah.
We look different. You're taller. I'm better looking, but that's a joke.
This is how you get the sort of Kurt Vonnegut, Harrison Bergeron phenomenon, where then the effort to create equality, you're putting weights on the feet of people who are faster than someone else, and you could teach that. I don't know if Harrison Bergeron is still taught, but I think there are some things that colleges and universities can do to help people feel free to have those disagreements that are so important. You can co-teach classes where you have two faculty members who have differing opinions co-teach the class. You could force devil's advocacy. You can use the Socratic method, which is just the constant questioning of premises. You can do what I used to take Toastmasters, public speaking course, and we would come in there to these classes sometimes, and we'd have a topic, but you wouldn't know what side of the debate you were supposed to take. And so there was one that I did on the export-import bake, something super boring and sleepy, but I didn't know what side I was going to have to defend the export-import bake or oppose it.
Right.
And I think just these systems that can make students feel more comfortable taking the opposite side, either because there's faculty members who are modeling it in front of them, or because you don't actually know what the student believes, so you can't criticize them. They're forced to play devil's advocate.
But I think to that point, there are two sides to every coin, right? And it doesn't mean one's right or wrong. Maybe one could be more right in a circumstance. Circumstances sort of dictate, policy to some degree, or how you may think about something. Like my brother would ask me about the death penalty, and I'd go, I'm for it. And he'd go, well, what if it's our brother? Well, what did he do?
I want to meet your brother.
Yeah, he killed someone. Well, who did, then death penalty, but it was in self-defense. Oh, okay, I didn't know. So so my point is, every time you get a little bit more information, it's like a math equation.
Yep.
The more knowns, the more ability for me to solve the equation.
Yes.
But the less knowns, the less ability.
Learning is the constant process of discovering our own ignorance.
Yeah. So, Nico, lots of great work done by your organization. And
Thank you.
I'm actually, when I learned about you guys, it's been over a decade ago, and I met with one of your folks, believe it or not, at a pheasant hunt that a billionaire friend of mine took me to.
How do I get invited on those trips? I haven't done one of those yet.
Yeah, you didn't make that. So, it was a very impressive organization. But what I want to know from you, and personally, or maybe speaking on behalf of the organization, where do we see this going, evolving to, and how do we come to this better understanding? Because again, I think one side is looking at this as a win and a loss, and I think that the pragmatists among us are saying this isn't about winning or losing. This is about us coming to this greater understanding about, we all agree, diversity, equity, and inclusion, or equality, and however you want to frame it, are things that are necessary. We don't disagree with these things. But the way that it's being implemented and forced upon us, we feel like we're really in a battle and a fight. So where do you see this evolving?
Yeah, well, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the late Supreme Court Justice, said America is nothing if not a pendulum. When it swings too far in one direction, it has a tendency to swing in the other direction, often too far in the other direction as well. And I think we're starting to realize that the implementation of DEI on college campuses has swung too far in one direction. You even see some of the proponents, the strongest proponents of DEI, saying, yeah, it probably swung too far. And it's starting to swing in the other direction. But there are things we can do to slow it down so it doesn't swing too far in that other direction. So I'm optimistic. Things are getting better, I believe. But they'll never be great until we start to actually look at the college experience as one of discovery, as one of truth-seeking, as one of understanding, where what unites us is greater than what divides us, where we are forgiving when someone makes an argument we think is wrong-headed or stupid. That's just not where we are currently, but I think there are things that colleges and universities can do to get us to that place. First of all, they can clearly articulate the mission of their university. They can adopt statements of institutional neutrality, where the administrators aren't putting their thumb on the scale and saying to students, this is what we believe about abortion or the most recent election or the war in Ukraine. Let the students and faculty members debate those topics. They can eliminate DEI litmus tests for faculty hiring and promotion. They can ask their students questions about how they talk across lines of difference. In the admissions process, they can have orientation programs that talk about all of these values. These are things, and they can seek to understand their campuses better by polling the students. Do you feel free to speak here? If you get bad polling back, there's something you need to change. You can't change anything, or at least you don't know how to change things unless you have good data about what's actually happening. So there are things administrators can do to help us get colleges and universities to a place of truth-seeking. And some of them are starting to do that. So I am optimistic, but I don't want to count my chickens before they hatch.
So you say some are starting to do it.
Sure.
And we've identified earlier some colleges and universities that are starting to mitigate DEI. I think there's a worry by the other side that it's just being hidden, that it's not really being, we're not going to see some wholesale change where suddenly there's a shift in conservatives being hired or people that are willing to challenge what's now become the classic way of and I'm going to call it leftist because it's dominated by leftists. But is that going to be one of the key performance indicators when we look at it and say, whoa, boy, it's no longer 25-1 lefty college professors versus those on the conservative side? Or is there another measuring stick? Is it,
Well, that's the challenge. Measuring culture is always hard, right? So you can implement the policies, you can hire administrators who say all the right things, but ultimately I think getting a diversity in the student body, a true diversity, racial, sex, socioeconomic, viewpoint diversity, people bringing different experiences that result in differing ideas that then clash, I think can produce an outcome that at least, if it doesn't eliminate the problems we've seen, at least makes them harder to take on the sort of illiberal tone that they've taken on recently. So you need to get the delta between 25 liberal professors and one conservative professor down. There's just no way you're going to have a liberal environment in that situation. You need to admit students who care about the truth-seeking mission of the college or university, but you need to be careful that you're not implementing political litmus tests on the other side in order to achieve it.
Well, I guess part of me agrees with you, but I look at student body of most of the colleges and universities, it's very diverse. I mean, there's hardly a campus that you go to that you don't, it's like the UN, at least the ones that I've visited.
Sure.
And outside of the HBCUs, which are the historically black colleges and universities, which, by the way, many of them have student populations of 25% or more non-black that are now attending. So they're even becoming a lot more integrated. So I don't see the diversity or inclusion piece of it there. I see this ideological around the E, right? The equality and equity and whatever being more pronounced or being more looked at in the campuses. So I don't know that the student body is as much of a concern to me as it is just what's being taught.
Well, it depends how you consider diversity, right? Yeah, they have most certainly gotten more diverse along many important metrics. But are we seeing viewpoint diversity within the student body?
No.
That we're not. You look at certain colleges and you see the ratio similar to what you see in faculty or even greater. So at least in my opinion, viewpoint diversity is an important aspect of diversity.
Completely,
So that's the problem with DEI in a nutshell, though, is that it's a very narrow perspective on what diversity, equity, inclusion actually is. And I think, at least if you want to achieve a diversity of thought, you need to look beyond it.
I agree with that. So just in summary, from a we would agree that these policies are now starting to mitigate, not only on college campuses, maybe not to the degree or the speed at which we'd like to see it. We're seeing it happen in corporate America. Give me your view of the future.
Well, I have to be an eternal optimist. Otherwise, there's no reason to do this job, right? If I don't think that we can win. I think we're going to win in the court of law, and I think we're going to win in the court of public opinion. I think Americans are already starting to see the excesses of this movement. They've already started to see the censorship. Americans have a fundamental understanding of fairness, and censorship is a fundamentally unfair thing, right? If you have a free marketplace of ideas where different arguments are allowed to be presented and their side of the argument loses, at least then they can understand the outcome. This is why you had so many people frustrated surrounding COVID, is that there were certain things that you couldn't say that would get you deplatformed on social media, that would get bring the government in to try and pressure these private companies to shut you up. And so it's no wonder that you had distrust of those in authority. They were just censoring everyone left and right. And this is the reason that we have all these checks and balances in our criminal and civil courts as well. Because if you have those checks and balances, if you allow this sort of freedom to make all the arguments and cross-examination or what have you, then people are going to trust the outcome of the process.
So last question, we talked about the pendulum, and I know physics. So, you let the ball go and it swings to the exact, the arc of whatever the force that was let on it. So that being said, and you said you want to stop it from going.
Want to catch the ball before it goes too far in the other direction.
Middle. So is that I think many people would argue that once you've gone this direction, pushing something far left, that it almost you deserve to push it to the far right, because that would, in effect, create equilibrium, because now you've got these two forces sort of pushing back on each other. I know FIRE doesn't see it that way. You want to stop the ball right here, which is possible, okay? But I do believe that there may have to be a little bit more of that pendulum swing to the right to push it back. Any final thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, we're a civil liberties organization, right? And so we aren't, I think if you say we're going to censor them because they censored us, it just ends up becoming a race to the gutter. And Jon Stewart, the comedian, has this phrase that he says is, if you abandon a principle as soon as it's challenged, it's not a principle, it's a hobby. And I think we need fewer free speech hobbyists. We need principled advocates for free expression who aren't going to abandon it because they see this as the opportunity to go get their ideological opponent. That's hard, right? That means sometimes giving your ideological enemy the grace that they would not afford you. But that's the golden rule, right? Do unto others as you would want done unto yourself. And if that's not a recipe for winning, then I don't know that I want to live in a society where you win, because that just seems like no fun.
It's a great way to end it. Thanks for your time.
Yeah, it's great chatting.